But if you want to work with somebody who's comfortable with somebody who's killed someone, reach out to GUSAC, which okay, I saw that as a dubious honor. And I said, well, if you put it like that, how can I say no?
You're listening to Creativity Unconfined. Stay tuned to learn about how the arts unlock the doors for those who are imprisoned.
All right, well, I suppose I'm the one who will be doing the digging.
Yeah, that's right. So get your shovel out, Ms. Nichols. For those of you who don't know, the voice behind the other microphone is Sydney Nichols, one of the producers of this fine program. So I appreciate, Ms. Nichols, you putting yourself out there and doing the digging.
What a fine program it is. So for this episode, we decided that we would kind of continue off of our most recent episode, at least as of this moment in time, which is Grace Ellen Hanna with the FADP, Floridians advocating for alternatives to the death penalty.
That is correct. Yeah, the alternatives to the death penalty.
And I mean, we spoke briefly about this. You have maybe a connected story with your work in forensics.
Yeah, I have to say that one of the conversations that came up between Ms. Hanna and I was that I had been involved in some capital murder cases, particularly for those that were to be considered for the death penalty. Let's back up a little bit. My work in California, working in the prisons up there, there were times, because I was on the mental health unit within that prison, there were times that we would receive some people from San Quentin, where the where death row basically was for California at the time. And we would be asked to provide evaluations for some of those people that were on death row for their mental health, and to see if they were of the right mind to understand their experiences and whatnot. It's fairly, it's a cynical position to find yourself in, where you're trying to determine whether or not a person has the mental capability of understanding their punishment and the crime, and not the crime, but their punishment, and whether or not they understand what this penalty will do. So that had been my early exposure with those that might have been on death row. But years later, and when I say years later, this was already when I found myself out here in Tallahassee, Florida, at Florida State University. I had, there was a time that I was trying to pull away from the prison work for a while. I needed some distancing. I needed some time away from it, because it can be a lot. And out of the blue, this must have been 2006, I believe, 2006, 2007, and I received a phone call from an attorney or a paralegal or an attorney's assistant out of the Midwest. And she called me up and she said, Dr. Gusak, we recognize that you're an art therapist. I am an assistant to an attorney who is known as death row attorneys, and their position is to work with those that are on that would be tried to determine whether or not they should receive the death penalty for that particular state, and if they would be on death row. And she had asked for me to help evaluate one of the people that they were considering, that this is a person who had murdered someone. They had discovered that he had done a great deal of artwork, and they wanted me to evaluate this artwork. And I said, no. I said, I am not a forensic art therapist. I am an art therapist who works in forensic and correctional settings. And that's a distinction that a colleague and I had made years ago. My colleague, Marcia Sue Cohen-Liebman, out of Pennsylvania, she and I wrote an article together back in 2000 called Investigation versus Intervention, Forensic Art Therapy versus Art Therapy in Forensic Settings. And I, of course, worked in the forensic settings, and she worked in forensics, in which she worked for the courts, and she would provide expert witness testimony using the artwork of those that would be testifying, so that the art served as evidence. And so I told her, no, I'm not the forensic art therapist you want. You actually want to reach out to Marcia Sue Cohen-Liebman out of Pennsylvania. She's the expert in this. And they said, no, we did reach out to her. But when we told her the situation in the case, she said, ostensibly, she said, my loyalties lie elsewhere, meaning her role is to provide evidence for those who have been abused or who have been victims, that the artwork by those who couldn't otherwise speak, such as children or those who were incapacitated, that she would provide assessments based on what their situations were, and that the prosecution would use that as evidence. And Marcia Cohen-Liebman has become renowned throughout the country for doing forensic art therapy. She actually wrote a book called Forensic Art Therapy. Excellent book. So I explained this to her, and I said, no. Well, when she said, we did contact Marcia Cohen-Liebman, she said, that's not where her position lies. She works with those that are victims. But if you want to work with somebody who's comfortable with somebody who's killed someone, reach out to Gussack. Which, okay, I saw that as a dubious honor. And I said, well, if you put it like that, how can I say no? So, by the way, I now have on my Vita, comfortable with those that kill, please reach out. But so I said, well, what is it that you're looking for? And she said, well, what we'd like to do is send you this artwork. A CD-ROM that tells you how long ago it was, a CD that contains all of this artwork. Now, the CD is password protected. You have to promise that you won't show this to anybody. But we want you to provide a summary of what you see. And that was a very interesting approach. She says, we're not going to give you any more information than that. And rightly so. She wanted me to essentially make a conclusion based on what I saw. I said, can I reach out to any colleagues that I know that? She says, well, one or two, that would be fine, but keep it to yourself. And so I did reach out to a colleague just to kind of bounce ideas off of. But I received this CD-ROM in FedEx next day mail, priority. And I looked at it, and it was some unusual artwork. And I realized that when looking at it, that there were patterns that were emerging in the art. Now, I didn't know anything about these art pieces. I just know what they look like. So here I was being asked to make a conclusion, based on...
You don't know him either. You've never spoken with him.
No.
And that's... what's going through my mind, interestingly, right now is like, well, that kind of goes against the whole philosophy of like, we don't, as art therapists, we don't make assumptions or judge the artwork. That's done in conjunction with the person who made it.
Yeah.
So continue on. I just had to.
You had to put that in there. I'm glad you did, because as one of your instructors, I'm very proud that you said that, because that's what we teach our students. They're basically asking me to analyze the work, not assess the work. Mm-hmm. And so I was kind of torn, but I still recognized that there was a lot of patterns, and I realized what I needed to do, knowing that I hadn't spoken to him. Didn't speak to who had created this work, didn't watch him create the work. I needed to look at the formal elements of the work. And by formal elements, what I mean is, and this is derived specifically from Linda Gant and Carmelo Tobone's Formal Elements Art Therapy Scale, in which they created an assessment technique in which they looked at how a drawing was made. Not the content per se, but the drawing itself. The space on the page. The line quality, is it scribbled? Is it pressured? Is it loosely sketched? Is it hesitant? How much space is used on the page? Is it the whole page? Is it covered up the whole page? Is it just a quarter of the page? Is it fragmented so that there's images all over the page? Is there interactions between the elements on the page? What does the composition look like? What does the color fit? Are the colors being used for what they're intended to be used for? Is there a prominence of color? How many colors are being used? Because how many colors are used is a lot more important than the colors that are used. Mm. And so there were a lot of the formal elements, and I started recognizing it took me a little bit of time, and I looked at them for about 3 or 4 weeks, and there's easily 100 images on the slide. And I realized also by looking at these that these were done over a large period of time. Some of them were older than others. They were in very poor shape. Some of them looked like they had been scraped off the ground, like they were stuck somewhere and that they had been scraped up. But I started recognizing, now the way the FEATS works is that it's used to assess specific diagnostic categories, specific diagnoses. Schizophrenia, bipolar manic type, neurological impairments, and depression, and of course, a level of an absence of all of those. And so when looking at these, I recognized that there was patterns that showed that there was a combination of those elements. And so when we scheduled a time to speak 3 weeks later, the paralegal got on the phone and I put her on speaker and she says, okay, can you tell us what you've seen? And I spent about 45 minutes to an hour speaking with her about the drawings. And she was very exact. She was asking me which image I was looking at, what elements in the drawing did I see, and ultimately what I told her was the patterns that I saw demonstrated a combination of schizophrenic-like symptoms, like schizophrenia, and mood disorder, similar to manic episodes, as well as some depression, which a combination of that is schizoaffective disorder, particularly as determined by the DSM back in 2006. But I told her, I said, you recognize that I'm an art therapist. I am not licensed to be able to provide a diagnosis. That's not what I can do. I can give you an assessment and an assumption of what I see. She says, but let's walk through this and tell me how you see this. And I spent a great deal of time talking about this. And she said, this is wonderful. This is really good. I really appreciate all the information you're providing. She said, I believe, and let me talk to the legal team, but I believe that we would like to go ahead and secure your services to provide expert witness testimony based on this artwork. And remember, this happened around 20 years ago, so I may be a little convoluted. I wrote all this down, by the way. Okay, if you're interested, I wrote all of this down. This later became the subject and the focus of the book Art on Trial. So this provides an in-depth examination of all of that. But I was very clear with her. I said, I can't assess this unless I actually see the person, get a chance to speak to the person, know more about the person, and actually watch him do the work. And she said, okay, well, now here's a little bit of background. She says, now what I'm going to tell you is confidential. You can't tell anyone at the time.
Yeah.
At the time.
Right now, broken.
And that was very key. And I'll explain why. Because I had to sign a non-disclosure contract, and I refused to sign it at first. And so let me back up a little bit. She did explain to me that this is a person who was on trial for the murder of his child and the attempted murder of his other child, which by this point, I had already looked at the work. Here I was, I felt torn. This is a person who had murdered an innocent life, as many of the people I've worked with have done. But I was being asked as part of the defense to provide testimony because what they were looking for, and I realize that this is a convoluted way of getting around to this, they were looking for a way to mitigate the death penalty. And in the state that they were from, that a mental health diagnosis or a mental illness can be enough, if you can demonstrate a mental illness at the time of the crime, would be enough to mitigate the death penalty. And that's what they were looking for. They recognized that this person likely had a mental illness and they needed support for this. And so they said, we would like to hire you to be the expert witness. We would like you to provide reports on the work that you've seen and likely come out and meet with him and assess him and whatnot. And they sent me this contract. And it said, I can never disclose any of this information or talk about it. And that's when I said, no. I said, I'm an educator and I'm an art therapist. This is the type of work that we need to be able to teach from, that we need to be able to show the value of what it is that we do and use this as an opportunity to teach and write about. And she said, let me talk to the team. And they came back and they said, we can make that amendment. We can write this in such a way that once all the appeals are done, you would be free to speak about this, write about this, and present on this. So you see now that I'm now in this position to do so. So they said, we'll get right back to you. So 6 months later, I heard back from them. And she said, we're still working on this case. We're still working on the details. We've now had to go through a hearing that would allow us to use you as an expert witness. So I had to go through, and I didn't know this till later, I went through a Daubert hearing in which I had to provide all of this information about myself, and they had to determine through the courts whether or not I could become a viable expert witness. So they said, so we're now in the process, so we should be going to trial very soon, so we'll get back to you as soon as we can. So I heard from them again when I was in Peru the summer of 2009. And they said, and I was in Peru because I was out there picking up, my son had just adopted us from the mountains of Peru. And so now here I am with a 10-month-old infant. Mm-hmm. And now I have to have this Skype call on through these channels to say we need to have a conversation. We're ready to go to trial. And here I was having to provide expert witness now for somebody who had murdered their child. And here I was holding a 10-month-old child. So needless to say, I was somewhat torn by the situation. It was a heavy moment. And I recall, just having to kind of struggle with that, of knowing what he had done, but also recognizing that I had seen his artwork. And I knew that this was a person that likely had a mental illness. At the time. It turns out that when they went to arrest him, they were going through his home and they were going through his garage, and they found in the garage a total and utter mess. I saw a photo, which is provided in the book, of this garage, which served as this art studio. And it was filled with all this artwork. A lot of it was glued to the floor. Remember I said it looked like it had scraped up. Some of it stuck to each other. Some of it was moldy. Some of it was mildewy. It was just haphazardly kept, with all of these pads and drawing paper and little sculptures all over the place. And it turned out that this had been artwork that he had been doing for 20 years. So what I was seeing was patterns of artwork that demonstrated that 20 years prior to the murder, he had been demonstrating mental illness, an unchecked mental illness. And then several years after, because here he had been in jail waiting trial for several years, and I was brought in to then meet with him. I asked him to do a couple of other drawings, including the formal elements art therapy scale, picking an apple from a tree. I had him do a couple of free drawings, and they were the same drawings that I saw on the page, on all of those hundreds of images. It's the same style, same format. He was quite fantastical. His statements would go off into different directions. He was never really well focused. So I of course asked him about the artwork, and I showed him a number of these art pieces. I spent a couple of hours with him, and needless to say, many of his descriptions of this work were not reliable.
Interesting. Because my thought as you're explaining this is like, well, people often assume, maybe rightly so, that lots of artists are a little eccentric or kooky or crazy or, off the wall. So I'm interested how you would describe his artwork and patterns that show up not just in his words are different from like a Jackson Pollock.
Well, now you're making the case, which brings up another conversation about the frenzied dance of art and violence, about the work of Jackson Pollock. And we're not assuming that mental illness and success as an artist are mutually exclusive. Jackson Pollock had his own issues, of course, and he had alcoholic issues and drug issues and was quite violent and aggressive in a lot of ways. However, the differences between what I may see in a Jackson Pollock or a Picasso or whatnot is that even within the imagery that may be abstract or unusual, there's still well-structured patterns in composition, and there's thought in the process of how they make the work. The drawings and the art pieces that I was looking at, they were fragmented, they were disconnected. The line quality was erratic and inconsistent throughout the page, on the same page. And so what we saw in a lot of these images was that there was disconnection, poor color use, erratic line qualities, fragmentation, disconnections, rotation throughout the pages. There was no consistency in a lot of the imagery.
So different even from like a surrealist.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Again, you take a look at somebody like Dali, who I also wrote about the frenzied dance of art and violence, who had his own issues and had his own problems. They're well constructed and they're well considered, and there's sense and logic in the illogic in those works. There's none of that in these pieces. So I did meet with him. By the way, I was deposed by the prosecuting attorney. We had a lengthy meeting in which I had to go through this case. By the way, I want to point something out here. So I go to the city where this is taking place, and for legal reasons, I can't really explain where this happened. And so I was called in after meeting with him. I was called in to meet with the attorney. She called me, and she's very serious, very strong-willed. She was brilliant person. And she sat me down. She says, "Tell me what you see. And tell me what happened during that interaction." So I spent around 10, 15 minutes explaining to her all the things that I'm seeing. She goes, "Hold it right there." And she stops and she calls in someone else who turns out to be her legal partner, who was also going to be trying this death row case and defending this person. And she says to me, "Okay, start again and describe everything that you're seeing." So I started giving details of everything that I'm seeing again. And that's when he says, "We need to make sure he gets in front of the judge." Now, the reason that's significant is because this person was dead set against bringing an art therapist in. It was the paralegal who saw all of this work around the floors, the attorney's assistant all over the floors, and said, "We need to get an art therapist in here who knows what they're looking at." And he said, he was against this. He said, "This doesn't make any sense, so there's no way we're going to get this through." So once I started explaining everything and pointing out all of what I was seeing and the details and how it represented this mental illness, and I'll tell you something that happened later, that was when he said, "Okay, we do need to get him in front of a judge. Oh, by the way, we have some more artwork." And so I went to another room and they showed me more sheets of pads with another 40 or 50 pieces, and they opened this drawer and there was this unusual sculpture in there that was staked. It looked like a body, but it was staked to the front yard. It was a mannequin that he let rot. And it was very disturbing to see it pulled open like you would see it in a in a morgue when he was pulling open the drawer, and it was like, oh, it was so creepy. But I had to go through that work again and then meet with him yet again in the jail because I had gone over all of this work. I needed to speak with him again. I was deposed by the prosecuting attorney, who spent 2 or 3 hours in front of the defendant and explaining what all of this artwork looked like. By the way, it was during that meeting that the prosecuting attorney asked me, "So have you written about this?" And I said, "No, not yet." And he goes, "Okay, good. I think you should write about this." And it was his idea for me to write about this. Not the defense attorneys, it was the prosecuting attorney. I did speak to him later. I interviewed him as part of the book. I also interviewed the judge and the defense attorneys. And I reminded him of that conversation. He goes, "Absolutely. I thought you should write about this because, quite frankly, when we were doing our own research, we couldn't find anything out there, and it would have been nice for us to know what we were facing." So, but I also think it's very valuable and very important, and I do appreciate that you know, what you put into this. So he was actually very supportive. Needless to say, I went ahead and did the deposition, and I went to trial. By the way, it turned out that by the time we went to trial, they had already plea bargained out to a certain degree. The plea bargain was that death would be off the table. So they would no longer be trying him for the possibility of death or capital punishment, but they still needed to determine what a sentence would be, and they still needed me to testify. So I did go into court, and I was not aware of who else testified. I didn't speak to anyone else about their testimony, and I didn't really know. All I could do was testify on what I saw in the work. And I want to point something else out too, because I still was struggling with all of this, and I made this very clear to the defense attorneys and the prosecuting attorneys, because, and this made things a little bit easier for me. What I thought he did was horrendous, and how he did it was horrendous. So in order for me to do this, I had to engage in some cognitive gymnastics. What I basically had to say was, I'm not testifying for or against this defendant, and I'm not testifying for or against the death penalty. I'm simply testifying on the art.
So it's clear that an art therapist can fit anywhere on this continuum. But maybe a misnomer that's less common now, but people still think, is that kind of the conflict that you had entering into this trial of like, you're on the side of the art. And people it's just a divisive topic. I'm having trouble even constructing a statement. Like, maybe people are afraid that the art therapist will advocate for someone who's scary, and that makes them afraid that they're in danger somehow or in harm's way. Obviously, I know the story behind this, but I wonder what the public perceptions are. Can you speak to any of that?
Yeah, I think that would be great for a longer conversation, but certainly recognize that as scary, quote unquote, as this person was, he suffered from a debilitating mental illness that went unchecked. And he was scared. It doesn't excuse what he did. I certainly don't excuse what he did, and I think he should certainly be punished for it and receive treatment for it. And also, he's not a two-dimensional monster. He's a three-dimensional person who went through a great deal of trauma and experiences himself that resulted in a horrible, horrible situation that is just unimaginable. And that still keeps me up at night when I stop and think about some of the work and some of the things that he had done and some of the work that I had done with him. I said in the book, I will not indicate what my position is for or against the death penalty. And I did not during the case, and I did not in the book because I didn't feel it was the right place. I have my own stance on the death penalty. I do think that he definitely did not deserve to be put to death. They say that witnesses should perhaps be objective. I say that it would be unethical for a witness who is brought on a particular side to not advocate for his own side or her own side to actually come ahead and succeed, because that's my job. And I was brought on to testify on the work, and I was, as horrible as the situation was, as horrible as the sentence was, as irreversible as the horror and the pain that was done to the families that were involved, I have to get some level of satisfaction that we were able to demonstrate that the art did indeed provide a viable understanding of who this person was, even within the 3 or 4 hours that I was given to testify.
So as the art therapist, yeah, you're on the side of the art, and the art is the truth. So perhaps that's the truth, the narrative that might make people feel a little more comfortable.
Maybe we should just end with that. The art is the truth.
Creativity Unconfined has been brought to you by Florida State University's Institute for Arts and Art Therapy with the Imprisoned. Special thanks to our producers Sydney Nichols and Malia Burrows, as well as Florida State University's College of Fine Arts. If you like what you heard, and even if you didn't, please support us by liking and subscribing.